Okay, we'll make a start, although oddly today, for some reason, the IT issues have moved their location in that, as you can see by the thing above the exit sign, apparently it's not recording today. So I don't know why that's not doing that, but anyway, you guys are the lucky ones. Everyone else, yeah, not so much. Okay, so yeah, welcome to our Week 5 lecture for Kit 711. Now, in this unit at the moment, we're currently doing written tasks, little baby assignments, as it were. Our major assignment that we're going to hear more about in the coming weeks is actually going to contain a threat and risk analysis. So it's pretty important we understand sort of what are our goals, what are our intentions, what do we actually do when we undertake one of these, so that when we undertake one in our assignment, we can actually do a good job of it. So today's lecture is looking at threat and risk analysis in sort of 2 1-hour chunks. And then when we come back after the Easter break, there will then be a lecture that follows up what do we do with the outputs of a threat and risk analysis. So back to those written tasks. Obviously, it's actually on, cool. We've obviously submitted our first written task. We've been doing some marking of it, and that marking's due sort of Wednesday night, I believe, and there's the peer assessment that follows on from that. Now, a bunch of you have done the peer marking already. I was checking it occasionally on Saturday, and I could see marks come in from lots of students as they were marking on Saturday during the day while I was in here working. A key thing with that peer marking is for us to be constructive. We want to read and learn from each other, but at the same time, if someone's not done something as well as they should, we should be picking up on that. That's what peer marking is about, and critiquing and actually giving them a true assessment of their work. And hopefully others will do the same for ourselves. And by reading other people's work and being critical of it, we'll actually get better at writing them ourselves, even if we weren't getting our own feedback from other places, because we'll actually learn through that process. So as you're peer marking, be constructive. If someone's done something poorly or they've forgotten to do a thing, tell them, but tell them what's missing, how they can improve. If it's the referencing they've done wrong, tell them where in the referencing they should be looking. When it comes back around to the marking feedback, which will happen later in the week, when you get your peer assessment marks back, read it and think, you know, this person's trying to be helpful, trying to be constructive. Is what they're saying correct? Now, if they've said something that's completely wrong, you can actually write that in the feedback and give your sort of feedback mark in aligned to that. And that'll then appear to me, if someone's doing a poor job, I'll then actually be able to jump in there and fix the mark and that sort of stuff. But be honest with yourself. If you did a not very good job and your feedback says that, you might want to actually think, oh, right, they've done a good job at this. They've done the correct kind of job with their marking part. I need to do a stronger assignment. So as we're looking at peer marking and the feedback cycle loop on it, try and be honest about it. Because the marks that you give end up bouncing back to me, and I then look at them. So if there's things don't align with the marks that were awarded and then the feedback that goes with it, it actually then rises to the top of all of the assignments. It then gives me red alerts to go and look at. And so I'll then look at them, and I'll end up contacting all the people who did rubbish feedback and all the people who did rubbish marking, and I'll be sending through stuff, comments there, and I'll be adjusting marks. If it gets marked poorly, I'll then be marking it myself to then fix it. So across all 3 written tasks, I'll end up marking all of you probably at least once to fix up mistakes and things. So just be aware of that I am actually looking through all of those, and when the feedback and the marks attached don't align with each other, then that's when it actually gets looked at by me. So our second written task, we don't get to choose any old thing. We actually have 4 set topics, and we've got to choose those by the 5th of April. Now, at this point, 95 students have selected a topic, so good job to you guys. Amusingly to me, a lot of them have picked the e-passports topic, which I actually think in the context of this assignment, it's the hardest one. So I logged in and went, oh, considering what this thing says to do about this, they've all jumped on the one they've heard of or they're aware of because they've got one. But if you look at what the assignment asks you to do, it's quite possibly the hardest topic to do. So that amused me. I reckon most of you have looked at the other three, and the top two they've got, ooh, don't know what that is. That's got weird letters. That must be hard. The first two are the easiest two on that list because there are lots of things that people talk about. And they talk about their strengths and their weaknesses. And the assignment is discuss the strengths and weaknesses of one of the following. So yeah, in terms of the FIDO ones, if you're not sure what, I didn't bring it. I have on my car keys and my house keys, I have a FIDO. So it's just, I plug it in. It's like a USB key that plugs in and unlocks my computer. It's not, it's doing some fancy cryptography, but in terms of a concept, very, very easy to understand. It's a something you have kind of authentication. The top P applications, those are the things that generate a one-time code, a time-based one-time code. That's what that is. So for those of you who have got things like, not doing it, it's not generating, where's one that will generate one? I've got like 4 of them on my phone. Oh, they're all wanting me to say which thing I want to use it on. There we go, there's one. It's generating a number, generating a number. That's what that's about. Those generate number time applications for authenticating. And SMS authentication code, there's lots of weaknesses and discussion about how poor those are. It's really easy to flog people's authentication codes. So choose a topic by the 5th, get working on it, looking at the strengths and weaknesses there. It's a fairly straightforward little assignment. Yeah. Okay, so in this unit, we've got a bunch of readings. These readings come from a bunch of different textbooks. I'm not a fan of allocating units a textbook as a whole because you guys don't have to buy it. They're often very expensive. A whole bunch of students won't buy them and then they're disadvantaged by that. And so what I do is set readings from different books because I'm allowed to post up to 10% of a book onto Milo and you guys can get it for free. So there's 5 readings in this unit, across the unit, that all can have exam questions about the content in them. This week's lecture, as I've already said, is on threat analysis. One of our readings is on threat modelling. It's the threat modelling technique it looks at is called STRIDE. It's really useful for you to have a look at that reading before we then do our threat analysis practical. So after today's lecture, but before, I think this is probably the week 8 tutorial, you want to have read that reading because we'll actually be building on it. And you'll be in groups and you'll be doing peer assessment on each other about how useful each of you are to the group. If a bunch of you have done the reading and a bunch of you haven't, guess which ones are going to be marked as not useful? The ones who haven't read it. So I suggest you give it a read. That way you can do a better job on your major assignment, and when peer assessment happens, you don't look like the dummy in your group who's not bothered to read a book or read a reading. And just, it's very easy to read. It's hopefully quite interesting. But yeah, there's 5 readings. That's the one for this week. Okay, lots and lots of housekeeping this morning. So in terms of our schedule of things, this week's prac follows directly on with where we've been previously in terms of penetration testing. The practical that comes in our next practical class after this week does that as well. But then shortly after that, we're actually going to be then having 3 practicals that all focus on the assignment. And the one that comes in between our pen testing finishing off and those ones starting is an in-shoot group activity so we can sort of get to know people in our tute a bit before we then form groups the week after. So we're about to end up doing lots of group-based things in our tutorials because we will form groups in our tutorial groups for the major assignment. 3 of our practicals coming up will be working on the assignment. So they have to be groups that are inside of our actual practical class. Now, the week 6 lecture is actually cancelled. It's not going to happen. The reason being is, well, it's 11:12 now. My plane on that day lands at 11:20. So, unfortunately, I'll be on an aeroplane still at this point, coming in towards Hobart Airport. And so I did look at having someone else lecture then, Luke, who some of you have just seen. He was going to come to a guest spot, but his wife's baby is due like 2 days before. So it was going to be a little bit too much to juggle for him. So I've decided week 6 we just won't have that lecture, but there will be practicals that week. In terms of the practical in week 6 in the morning, another tutor will take it. It won't be me because I'll be on a plane, although I'll probably be in Melbourne Airport more likely, but another tutor will take that. So week 6, practicals are on, but no lecture. Now, that week 6 might be a little bit confusing because this week we've got today, Tuesday and Wednesday. Those are normal teaching days. Thursday, Friday this week are not teaching days. So if you've got a class this week on Thursday or Friday, you don't have to come to uni. It's all good. Then next week, Monday's a public holiday. Tuesday's like a fake public holiday. It's like a public holiday in Tassie, but nowhere else. So the uni will be largely shut, although I'll be here. Wednesday will be a teaching-free day, so all the staff will be here, but you guys won't be. But then Thursday, Friday, we'll be back around to teaching. So if you've got a class this Thursday, it takes place next Thursday instead. So the week is sort of split across 2. So when I talk about week 6, it's not next week, it's actually the week after. We're actually talking quite a distance away. I'll send an email to confirm about that. Our week 7 lecture follows on from today's lecture. Today's lecture we're doing risk and threat analysis. Today we're doing risk and threat analysis. We figure out what are all the problems with our system, what are all the problems with our ICT infrastructure. Week 7 we then go, well, what can we do about it? How can we fix it? So this week's lecture and the week 7 lecture are the foundations for those 3 practicals and the major assignment that we've got, that we're doing in groups. All right. Does anyone have any questions on any of that housekeeping stuff? Excellent. All right. I've just got a message from someone that's actually... No, it's all right. Thought it might have been about the lab. It was from a tech person. Okay, so this is where we're going today. The first hour, we're going to look at threat analysis. Second hour, we're going to look at risk analysis. Now, security assurance is a term that we see thrown around a little bit. And it's about us being assured, us being happy or confident that our system is safe, that our system is secure, that the steps we're taking around passwords and access control and patching of our services, all of these things are actually making us secure, about knowing that we're actually being defended against the threats that are out there. And that's actually often quite a hard thing to establish, because as I've already said, we never actually become perfectly secure. Security is a process that is ongoing, and we're constantly trying to take more steps to make ourselves secure. Understanding our system, understanding the people who might want to attack it, is how we are best able to defend ourselves. So if we understand who wants to attack us, why, what methods, what are they after, we're then able to take steps to make sure that that doesn't work. That the kinds of attacks they might launch against us won't actually succeed. Now, that's really what the next lecture and the one that follows it and those practicals and our major assignment are all about. How do we understand our system? How do we defend our system? And then hopefully flowing on from that, we can then get this thing that's assurance that we're happy that we're actually doing everything we can to mitigate, to lower the effect of an attack that might occur. So we need to understand the likelihood, the impact of a threat against us, and we need to actually write down and illustrate and implement the policies we're going to do to counteract those threats. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons we might defend our systems. We've talked about these in that very first lecture about actual losses against our company, reputation loss, duty of care and legislative requirements. We've talked about all that in week 1, and so I don't really want to dwell too much on it now. But from a business perspective, us having a successful attack taken out against us has a large cost. And we can look at lots of examples of losses that have happened in the past. We can look at surveys, and we're about to do that. We're about to have a bit of a look at that to get an idea of our threat landscape. But these are often underreported. Companies who might have an attack against them often might want to hide it. They don't want their share price to be affected by it. And so they might try to hide the fact something occurred, or they might try to protect their reputation. And so often these might get underreported. So as we look at the surveys we're about to have a look at, that are actually posted on Milo as well, we might actually expect that those numbers are actually underreported. Now, this underreporting is actually a bit of a problem, and in response to that, companies put in legislation to basically force reporting to occur. And that's actually just what recently happened in Australia. The notifiable data breach scheme came into effect on the 22nd of February this year. So from this year, from the 22nd of February moving forward, if a company has a data breach, they have to report it to the Office of the Information Commissioner to say, I've been hacked, this is what's been stolen. And they've actually got a time period to do that. They've got up to 30 days to report that that's occurred, or at least 30 days to make an argument to them to say that they don't need to disclose, is actually what the wording really is. This is actually an amendment to our existing Privacy Act, so we did see that Privacy Act get mentioned back in week 1. This is an amendment to that, and so it's basically using a bunch of those existing classifications for the sizes of companies and the types of data and saying these kinds of data, user personal details, if they get leaked, you have to report. If we find out you haven't reported, big fines and all the other kind of punishments that might then come along with that. Now, this is a piece of legislation which tends to mean it's quite interesting when you read it. As the kind of person I am, I read it and I see it as being very fluffy in terms of its language. It's not being very exact. And that's actually by design. When you read the legislation, it says that you have to report a data breach if it's likely to result in serious harm. What the toss is serious harm? It's a very fluffy term. And that's actually a good thing. Because while the legislation doesn't say that could lead to this problem or this problem or this problem, they're saying serious harm to then basically say that the courts will decide what serious harm is, because legislation is really hard to pass. Legislation, if it's exact, gets out of date really quickly. So by saying serious harm, what they're actually saying is if it can hurt someone in a negative way, and we'll let the courts decide what that actually means. Because court cases and having lawyers fight against each other is a much faster process that can evolve over time as to what definition serious harm means, much faster than legislation. So that's why they've gone with that wording, which even though at first read, I'm like, oh, that means nothing. Serious harm could be anything. But that's actually good. So moving forward, court decisions will define what serious harm is, the penalties as well. The penalties will actually change. They're actually a bit fluffy in there as well. And so court cases will then decide what that means. Australia is not the first place to have legislation like this. California in the US brought theirs in 2002, and the other American states have followed. So I think pretty much all the American states now all individually have laws that are based on that. The European Union had their first go at this in 2009, and they actually have a much, much stronger, beefed up version of it coming into effect of May this year. And so the one that happens in May of this year actually affects us here or people in other countries as well, because under the EU legislation that comes into effect in May this year, it says if the data that's been leaked contains any data about a European citizen, whether they live in the European Union or not, you have to report within 72 hours. So Australia is saying 30 days, European Union is saying 72 hours. And the European Union would also have much bigger fines than us. They love to fine in Europe. I'm sure they do that instead of taxing people, I think. They still tax lots. They're actually well known for throwing fines at people, the European Union. So while we're bringing in this law here, if our data that gets leaked contains data on European citizens, we actually have to report it even faster than the Australian law, otherwise we get fined by Europe. Which is an interesting turn of events, being fined by a different company, different country. Separate to that, Australia is the first APAC country to bring it in. So that's Australia and Pacific country. The only other country who's given it a crack at bringing it in was Singapore. Singapore tried to bring in legislation July last year, and it actually got knocked down. When I come back in weeks, I'm coming back from Singapore, as happenstance would have it. But Singapore brought it in and tried to bring it in with a whole bunch of other legislation around cameras and surveillance and police state stuff, and it got knocked down. But they'll end up putting it up again without it bundled with as much stuff, and then it'll happen. Now, in the Australian context, who does it cover? Who does it affect? Australian government agencies, all private sector health providers. Actually, anyone who deals with personal data is affected. In terms of a company, though, there's a little bit of a barrier of entry, that you've got to have a turnover of $3 million or more. So businesses or not-for-profits, if you turn over more than $3 million a year, you're covered by this, you've got to report. If you don't turn over much, you don't make any money, and don't have much data, then by association, you're not actually covered. So if it's a small little company, employs 2 people, and they've got data on a couple of hundred people when it gets hacked, they actually don't have to report, which is unfortunate. They're not required to. They still can, but they're not required to. I've already talked about serious harm and the maximum 30 days. Yeah. So that's the Australian context there, but now getting into some surveys. Now, this survey that I'm about to look at first, and it'll be intermingled with the previous publications of this survey, is a survey that comes out every 2 years by the Australian government. For the last certainly 3 or 4 lots of 2 years it's come out. So this one was published in October last year, and it's a survey about events that occurred in 2016. So it's a 2016 survey, but the data was collected in 2017 about the previous year. So it's about a snapshot of a year. This is who actually submitted to it. So mostly industry, but actually the first couple of years of this survey, government was the bulk of it. The government amount is fairly static, but the industry amount increases as more people submit to the survey. As it's an Australian government survey, all the government departments were forced to reply, whereas businesses, it's voluntary. So that's why it looks like government's a fairly big chunk, when actually it's not. It's a slowly shrinking part of this. So from this survey, it's found that 58% of Australian companies suffered at least one successful attack against them in 2016. So over half of Australian companies were hacked to some degree in 2016. And that's, again, the ones that are willing to say that in a survey. If we look at the previous two iterations there, it's much the same. If anything, it's slightly up on last year, but maybe not particularly a significant jump, but a jump. In 2015 version of this, it had a value about how over half the organisations increased their expenditure on security in the previous year. That question wasn't asked this year. It actually asked a whole bunch of finance-related questions that were all very specific to try and drill down into this around motivations about why they're increasing. Because at this point it's the expectation that they are increasing spending, and we see that reported in lots of other places, that the spending for globally on security is just shooting up everywhere. 51% of respondents said they tended to be alerted of a possible breach by external parties before they noticed them themselves. So over half of the respondents who said they got attacked said they were told they were hacked by someone external before they noticed it themselves. What this usually means is someone is writing to them saying, hey, just saw all your data for sale on the black market, or all your data is available for download here at this link. So half of the companies who got hacked didn't know until someone said, here's your data. We've got it. Very embarrassing for them, obviously. But that's the state of affairs. That's why we've got units on this. That's why you guys are all sitting there and why you're all wanting jobs, because these stats say there's jobs there, if we think about it. That's what this is saying. It's saying that industry is rubbish at this. Half of the companies getting hacked every year, and half of them don't even know they've been hacked. That sounds like we need more security IT professionals to me. So in terms of how many incidents are we talking about, so this is Australian companies, there was 47,000 incidents identified in 2016. Australia's small. Some of you come from countries that have cities that have as many people as Australia has. Right? Australia is small. If we then think of this number and blow it up globally, the number of cyber incidents is astronomical. That's why there's rapid increase in spending in this sector globally. And when they talk about the increased spending in this area over the next 5 years, they're not talking millions, they're not talking billions, they're talking trillions. That is why. 50% of the threats were actually known to the organisation. They were in their risk register. They were on their list of, these are the things that can happen when you defend against them. 57% of the attacks were in that list. They knew about it as a vulnerability. They knew about it as part of their attack surface. They didn't mitigate it well enough with enough policies, or whatever was got around, whatever was there. Only 48% of incidents were reported to an external agency. So, and that was 40% in the private sector. These numbers will change. I've got these here purely because 22nd of February this year means those numbers have to change. When this survey happens again next year, about this year, if that was the answer, the Office of the Information Commissioner and the Australian government be giving out fines. So these numbers for this one should skyrocket now, because 60% of that private sector there should be closer to it should be reporting. That's not reporting at the moment. If we just jump back in time a little bit to the 2015 one to look at a few more things that were asked in that survey that weren't asked last year, here's some interesting things, which is where we get the idea that there are certainly jobs in this space, and there's certainly the need for upskilling of people currently in the workforce. 89% of respondents think general staff need to improve their IT security. So 90% of staff think they need to improve their security skills. So 10% are perfectly happy, right? That's a lot of training of the workforce that needs to occur. 83% of respondents think management need to improve their IT skills. 76 think IT staff need to improve. So across all three of those top categories, management, IT staff and general staff, over 75% in all three categories need more IT skills, more security-specific IT skills. The lowest number of these categories was actually for the C-level. So CEO, CTO, CISO, all those C-level people, the ones that get the big bucks, they're the ones that actually were the lowest ranking. It's still 60%, still more than half, but they're the lowest one. Now, that's partially because there's a lot of training at that level occurring lots of places, or in addition to that, those sorts of positions now, you can't get them unless you've got a proven track record around security or aware of security. So that's changing. It's a top-down thing. Once all the C-level care about security, everyone below them will care because the people above them care. So that's just showing that change is coming, and it's coming top-down. So what were the main factors around the incidents that occurred? Staff errors or omissions, poor security culture. So they go, oh, we don't need to do that, it's fine. We'll just leave it as it is, unsecured. You know, poor security practice. Misconfigured systems. That's always hard. You feel bad for that IT guy. He thought he did a good job. He forgot to do a couple of steps. Suddenly it's misconfigured. It's vulnerable. They get hacked. It wasn't on purpose. It was just a mistake. That's always going to be a factor, but we're wanting to minimise those as much as possible. The fourth one down that list, targeted sophisticated attacks. So the top three were screw-ups by staff. The fourth one was a person putting real effort in, right? So it's still around that training side of things. If we look at actors of most concern, who are we most worried about? This is asking companies, who are you most worried about attacking your company? Insiders. The people we employ, who we might piss off, who might then decide they want to flog the data and get a new job, or flog the algorithm and get a new job, or whatever they're doing. People going out the door, taking stuff as they leave. Trusted insiders are the threat actors of most concern. So it's kind of hard to stop. We're talking about privileged users abusing their privilege to hurt the company. That's the one of most concern. Largely because it's the hardest to protect, but it's also the ones that can do the most damage. If we look down those lists, things like organised crime and state actors that are, you know, very sexy and cool are a bit, you know, down there, but it's realistically, most companies are concerned about all of those categories. Here's the threats of most concern, which at the top, 72 have got ransomware. This was prior to, this is the 2015 one. This is prior to the first half of last year, when ransomware took off and affected lots and lots of companies and shut down the chocolate factory here in Hobart, and a bunch of other things. So they were concerned about ransomware, but ransomware last year famously had massive, massive impact globally. Took out hospitals in the UK, and all sorts of other things around the place. So it's in their sights as a threat. It's in their sights as a risk. But last year we saw in 2017 dramatic effects from that top risk that they were concerned about in 2015. If we look down this list, we can see things like targeted emails, which are very common, social engineering, which are common. This week's shoot, we see a Trojan in action against Windows 10, so you actually see one of those. Denial of service is actually down quite low. You jump back 3 or 4 years, and it would have been much higher. Was the big concern, 2011, 2012, 2013, denial of service attack was very much the flavour of the month. Now it's very much more the ransomware side of things. This is jumping back to 2013. What parts of the organisation were most vulnerable? This sort of question hasn't been asked in the next two surveys, but it's good contextual stuff. What is the most vulnerable part? Internal. Just like in the 2015 survey, it said what actor scares you the most? Insiders. What part of your network's the least secure? The internals. They're not surprised. That's the answers you expect to hear. But these are the companies being aware that that is actually where their risks really are. That's their soft underbelly, as it were. So how do we study threats? Why do we study threats? If we're a company that's successfully not been attacked, and we're then trying to do what we see in this lecture and the next one, where we're doing a threat and risk analysis, we need to be informed of what things can occur, what things occur to similar sized companies as us that haven't occurred to us yet, that could be right around the corner. It helps us to get an understanding of what is the impact of it, which is really what risk analysis is about. So by studying them, we get an understanding of what kind of attacks we should worry about, what could occur, what's the impact. And so knowing about these past events, even if they haven't occurred to us, makes us informed about what can occur. Now, a great way to study them, and what we're going to look at a bit today, and we'll do in shoots and things, is around structured brainstorming. Is basically sitting down with people who've got some knowledge and thinking about what things can go wrong in our space. What are the threats that we're concerned about? What is our infrastructure? And actually just do a brainstorming activity around what threats are actually relevant to our situation. Now, as we go about doing that, we can actually look at what threats are there and how can we classify them. So we can do our brainstorming based on looking at what's actually possible to happen against us. Now, if we look at our system, we can look at the hardware. Well, what hardware do we have? And then work our way back from, next slide? Yeah. If we've got servers, that's a very visible part of our network. That's where attacks are likely to occur. We then need to think about what attacks could occur there, what are the threats that are there. How can we actually have policy to protect those devices that are such an obvious attack vector? We can look at the people involved, and our next slide's going to pull that apart a whole bunch. We can look at who might want to hurt us and then work back from that. Think about people's intent. What are they trying to gain from us? Intent, which we're going to come back around to, and then accidental stuff as well. So if we look at them under categories, we can try and get an understanding of what is the motivations of the people who might be carrying out an attack against us. The motivations of an internal person attacking us are going to be very different to the motivations of an external person. What's available to them in terms of methods of attack are dramatically different as well. So if we jump over to the people involved and looking at the kind of motivations they might have, they're going to end up having quite different access, different knowledge of our systems, different knowledge of what is valuable about this company. It's quite interesting if we look back at the Sony hack from a couple of years ago. The first things that came out about the Sony hack, other than, oh, they've been hacked, that you could see on the black market side of things, were network schematics. And then they got hacked again and again and again and again after that. Because the first people who broke in mapped out the network, did a whole bunch of stuff with that, stole a few things they cared about. And then what they posted online was network schematics of Sony. And there was all this sort of backlash, oh, Sony's been hacked. But what actually happened, when those network schematics got leaked, every hacker globally went, hey, let's go attack Sony, because they knew more about it. They then had this insider knowledge of that network and were able to attack it way more than those original people probably did. And so there was constant leaks from all these other groups about the attacks that then happened after that, because they got that leg up from that first group. So insider knowledge dramatically affects how effective an attack can be. And so as we look at the people involved, if we're looking at who we're protecting against, we need to think, okay, person outside's got this knowledge, person inside's got this knowledge. We then need to have our defences appropriately done. Computers make it pretty easy to actually commit fraud. That's what that insider threats are all about. Are they able to do things that might result in insider trading on the stock market? Are they able to actually flog money itself directly, which is less likely these days? Is there then actually collusion from that insider to the outsider? And actually, stock market manipulation is a big key sort of attack path there that's hard to then see. So from the outside, what are our possible people that might want to attack us? Well, rival companies who might be trying to get at what's our secret thing that makes us tick as a company. Cyber criminals from an organisation, that sort of amorphous sort of idea of, Russian hackers trying to get everything. Our bored nerd category, so the guy in his mum's basement with too much time on his hands, who's just curious, not necessarily malicious to steal all of our whatever, but are just like, can I get into there? Can I get into there? Can I get into there? Nation states is an interesting thing, and it's something we see in the news from time to time as a possible actor. It's very hard in this space to defend against that. If you're thinking about a company and then trying to defend that company against a nation state that's got almost unlimited resources, it's incredibly hard for that company to really protect itself, which is why things like the Sony hack and a few others we've seen lately that have been carried out by nation states, they're so successful because they're able to get in and get past all of the other sort of defensive measures that are there that from a company's perspective are about protecting them from other countries or the bored nerds. They're not looking at protecting themselves against what's effectively a military instrument of a foreign government. Lots of resources, lots of computing power, lots of researchers all hammering away. The bored nerd can't compete with that. If we look at nation states, there's been lots and lots and lots in the last decade or so that we can look at as examples of this. This year, Winter Olympics, there was an attack then. But as we go back up through here, Russia, US, Ukraine power grid, which is again Russian. We've got some North Korean stuff. We've got Israel doing things. You look down this list and you don't particularly find that many countries that have got clean hands in this space. Everyone's sort of involved in it. We don't have Australia appearing anywhere in the list. That's not because of my own bias or anything. It's just that we don't have as good of stuff. So when we do it, it's a little pissy little thing. When you've got the likes of China, Russia, America doing it, Israel. While Israel's a small country, in cyber they punch very above their weight. It's quite interesting. In Israel, they've got compulsory military service. It's not that uncommon. Other countries have got it. South Korea does it. The Scandinavian countries do it. Other European ones do. In Israel, a lot of them do their compulsory military service in cyber. And so they all get really good at that. And then just directly outside Tel Aviv is lots and lots and lots and lots of companies that are all cybersecurity companies. All of Microsoft's cybersecurity defense stuff is built in the suburbs outside Tel Aviv by former Israeli military personnel. So they punch a bit above their weight, whereas Australia, we're a bit lame. We don't have the skills. But if you look down there, we work with the US. We've got stuff in the middle of Australia that we're probably not proud of as a country. So there's lots and lots of examples there. And when you then see a nation state turn its attack to a company, it doesn't end well for the company. They're used to going up against other nation states that are pouring other unlimited funds into it. So a threat analysis, and what we're going to sort of work through, has two steps. And we've sort of started to outline the first one, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next couple of slides. We want to identify our threats. And that's kind of what we've been working our way through to sort of get us up to a little bit of speed. Now we're going to zoom in and go, well, what are we actually doing? We want to identify the threats that are possible against the company or whatever it is we're actually trying to defend. We want to get a list of threats that we can then pass over to the risk analysis. And the risk analysis might come up with more, but we're going to identify what attack avenues are there and what is the likelihood of that attack avenue actually eventuating. Us thinking about attacks, we could go, well, someone hacking in is an attack. A bushfire burning down our building, while not an attack, is a threat. It's an act of nature that's going to have a direct impact on our ICT infrastructure. So we want to capture all of those and want to think about the likelihood. And realistically, a building burning down, if it's in the bush in Australia, it's going to happen. If it's in the city, not so much. And so we've got to then figure out the likelihood. So out of our threat analysis, we want a list of threats and an estimation on the likelihood of it occurring. Our secretary clicking a link in an email that means that her computer gets compromised is very likely. People do dumb stuff. A nation state attacking us is probably extremely unlikely to occur. The way we handle those two threats need to be different. We need to train our secretary. There's probably very little we can do about the nation state threat. We might need to defend against other more likely threats. So again, as we're looking at this, we're just briefly looking at this. We've got a reading on threat modelling. We've got today's lecture. There's entire units, probably taught by business here, around risk and threat analysis. Right? It's a big area. There is entire books. Our reading, which looks at Stride, that threat modelling approach, is actually a Microsoft approach. But the main output we're looking for, and we're just sort of just grazing the surface with it in this unit, is we want a list of methods and sort of some sort of score or a guesstimate of the likelihood of that actually occurring, a probability that that is going to eventuate. Structured brainstorming, as I've already mentioned, is a good way to go about doing this. And what do we need to do that well? We need a group of people who can think creatively to try and put themselves in the position of an attacker, to come up with what kinds of things could be done against our infrastructure, whatever that might actually be. And so we need the people who can think. We want them to be prepared. We want them to know about the company. We want them to know about the infrastructure. If they don't understand our context, they actually aren't particularly useful. We want them to have a bunch of information about the kind of technologies involved. So we need knowledge, we need people, and then we need time together to actually do the brainstorming. So our preparation, the questions we could build our analysis around is, well, what do we know about attacks or threats that have happened against the company before or to similar companies? What categories can we look? We can have a bunch of categories to work our way through. So if we're a company that's got a web platform, we have to talk about that and what attacks could occur against it. If it's a company that actually does a lot of in-house code, but then it actually just sells and there is no web platform, then actually we've got to focus on that coding side of it. Now storage, whoops, keep doing that. Sorry. We've got to focus on how we're storing it, where we're backing up our code, where's our compiling occurring, all of those things. We need to actually look through the assets and what possible negative events could actually happen against them. So coming back around to intent there, this is a good point to talk about that as we're doing our brainstorming, thinking about, we've thought about people, we've thought about hardware. Now that we've got a good understanding of our infrastructure and the people in the room, throwing at them who would want to hurt us, what is the intent of people who might want to attack us, is an example of us breaking down that category further. If it's the insiders, if it's the opposing company, nice categories. Is it that lonely attacker? Looking at it from that perspective by intent is a great way to break it down further as to what our risks are. Espionage might actually be a threat that you don't particularly concern yourselves with because of the nature of the company. You might not have any particular IP that's of interest, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's still likely to be a thing. Now, the bottom line, blackmail and extortion, this has come up a lot lately. If I was doing this lecture 15 years ago, I might not have it here as much. Ransomware falls in this category. Denial of service threats were a big thing 5 years or so ago. So pay us money or no one will get to your website. That falls in this category. That was very much a thing, 2011 through 2013 in that denial of service space. These days, someone clicks on a link, whole bunch of your data gets encrypted, and you get a ransomware pop-up saying, pay this money or you won't get your data back. Which, with ransomware, the numbers around that sort of say that 50% of people who pay it still don't get their data back. So you might as well not pay, really, at this point either. Threat analysis has to cover accidents. It has to cover natural disaster. It has to cover people accidentally breaking things, accidentally, dropping their coffee onto the server, maybe, All of those things, what happens then? All of those kinds of things have to be covered because we need to then write policy about how do we respond to those sorts of things. Now, as we've worked our way through those and we come up with the kinds of threats that can occur, we need to look at them and go, what's the opportunity for this to occur? Our brainstorming session can't just cover this might be who it is against this bit of hardware. We have to go, what opportunity do they have to do that? Because we're trying to get to the likelihood. If there's lots of opportunity, it means the likelihood needs to go up. If there's very little opportunity, likelihood goes down. And so we need to then make sure our conversation and our brainstorming session actually zooms in on that, because the likelihood is vitally important as part of our output of this list of threats. So, very common approach, some kind of brainstorming session with a bunch of structure on it to identify the threats. Then we establish the likelihood of the threat actually occurring, so that can then be used by our risk analysis. That is our key outcome from a threat analysis, a list of threats and how likely they are to occur. We'll stop there and we'll have a 10-minute break. So we'll start back up at 5 past and we'll do risk analysis for the second hour. Questions? basically a half. It's Friday kind of holiday. And so Thursday, Friday this week are actually Thursday, Friday next week. So the first 3 days this week, the second 2 days of this. No classes this Thursday, they'll take place this following Thursday. And Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week aren't even. They've got a whole week off. The second semester, the week off is actually Monday to Friday. But because of the holidays for this one, they're actually Friday, Monday, Tuesday. Are also holidays. Yeah, so that was. So the data that they're talking about with is a leak of data, but it's not where people have access to stuff for shooting data. It was an allowed access where Facebook allowed too much data to go for the rest of. So if people do a quiz, and by agreeing to do the quiz, one of the agreements you share information, yeah, I'll share information, you share a whole bunch of your information, and then a bunch of information with your friends. So with your friends, age, sex, occupation, and all that stuff. So by doing it to lots of people, you actually get more information from the quiz, so you link all their connections, and then you go to the other connections, so everyone's connected to everyone, and you then try to go, well, what political opinion might they have, or whatever. And do networks. It's a data leak. It's not a breach. It's a breach means you're breaking through something. But it's a data leak. It's not.
Because they have provided that data.
It's provided legally. And Facebook actually changed policies on what data are allowed to come out. We're fighting that. Although, personally, I think now it's kind of like Facebook. I don't believe it's going to happen over there. They're still like, there was more. It's like 34 billion. Well, it drops Friday, and then we found it afterwards. Everyone's like, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to happen. It might drop 10 times, but again, there's a person coming in. Yeah.
Recently,
So when you take on a car provider and pay for a truck, what are they doing to support it's still your data. If you vanish on it, that company, your company, is going to be affected. You guys will feel the force of that more than the other company. So, you should look to see what they're doing. What are you storing? Each storing who's got the key? So that versions of the service that are how they pack. All that stuff that you care about on your own stuff, you still care about on the other side. Most of them don't do everything. So they want to be everything. Most of them building is good. You've got the Amazon stuff, they're better at it than you. So it is a case of you see what are they doing. But some providers, the way they do it. So you've got to ask, what do you actually be Okay, let's continue onwards. So, our output from our threat analysis is a list of threats that are possible against the organisation or company we're looking to protect. And so, from that process, we should get a good idea of the fact that we live in a risky world. We don't have zero risk. We have these possibilities of these bad things occurring. And if we think back to the survey at the start, can you stop talking up the back there? Thank you. If you think back to that original survey we first started looking at, it showed that over 50% of companies in Australia last year had some sort of successful attack carried out against them. So if our threat analysis comes back saying there's no threats, we've done a really rubbish job. There are clearly going to be threats there. And so what we're aiming to do with our risk analysis is to get an idea of where we're vulnerable and what would the impact of that thing be if it occurred. So the threat analysis is what could go wrong, how likely is it for that to occur. The risk analysis is basically the next step over from that, going, if that occurred, what would the impact be? How much would it cost? What data would they get access to? It's actually what actually happens if that occurred. What we're aiming to figure out is see, of these list of threats, what ones would destroy us as a company? What ones would put us on the front page of the paper? What ones would mean we couldn't function as a company anymore? And that is obviously the ones we want to defend the most. We're trying to get an idea of, with the amount of money we can spend on security, what ones should we actually spend our money against? Because we're looking to see what level of risk are we willing to accept. We don't have limitless money. We are operating inside the confines of reality and how much money our company has and how much time our employees have. And so what steps can we do to lower the actual risk that we have against those things that could do us the most harm? So we want to build on how likely those identified risks or those threats will eventuate, but what is the loss to the company if that happened? What is the loss? Is it a money thing? Is it a IP thing? Is it actually us getting fined by the government? Is that the real thing we're worried about there, and that really big speeding ticket effectively from us having that? What is the effect of those losses? If they eventuate and it means that we're actually going to end as a company, then it's something we want to actually defend against. So we want to manage those identified risks. We want to look at them and go, okay, these ones are the most impact. We need to deal with that risk. So if that threat eventuated, we could actually survive it. If it's the building burning down scenario, we're like, oh, okay, we'll get insurance. Building burns down, insurance company gives us money, we build it back up again. That's what we're looking to do with our policies on everything about our risk. We want to handle it. The policies, when we get to it in our next lecture, are us putting in place things that we're going to do to defend ourselves. They're not necessarily things companies aren't doing already. The very first policy document, which is the document you write in response to your risks, that a company ever writes, is largely writing down things they're already doing. They're formalising things they're already doing, if they're doing a good job at least. If they're doing a rubbish job, then it's different. But if they're doing a good job already, by just making smart decisions that smart people make, their first policy document is just writing down what they do now. And over time, as they get better defensive mechanisms, that policy document grows as a living document to then defend us better. So our risk management strategies balance out, or are aiming to balance out, the measure that we're actually going to put in place versus the actual loss that would eventuate from that thing taking place. Now, we're not aiming to do this to the point that we have no risk left over. If we're talking about a company, they've got a finite amount of money. They've got a set amount of money. They don't have limitless resources. They've got a little bit of money to spend on it. They can't remove all risk. They're trying to remove the ones who have the most impact. What we're really establishing then is what is the risk appetite of the company? What is the risk they're willing to live with to actually function? Now, to illustrate this, what I might do, I'm going to draw a diagram live, which is probably a terrible idea. One way to think of this is we can actually draw a graph. And this graph, is that chunky? That should be chunky. Is going to have a few things on it. Actually, what I want first is this. The first thing we're going to be looking at and covering on our graph, on one of our axes, is risk. The actual risk we're willing to live with as a company. On the other side, what we're going to have is cost. How much money can we spend to actually defend ourselves? And really across the bottom, which we're not going to talk about too much today, are the actual policies we're putting into place. I'll draw the graph and then I'll place companies on our graph. Now, the graph is going to be drawn terribly, but anyway. So I'm going to do my cost line. By doing nothing additional, our cost is zero. By not taking any steps to defend ourselves, we're not spending any money, right? But we could then spend lots. And so this graph starts off basically down at nothing and sort of comes along and then sort of rapidly goes up as we do all the sort of fancy measures. It probably should come a bit more through there, but anyway. There we go. Imagine I do that line first. That's sort of our cost line. The other side of it is our risk line. How much risk are we willing to live with? If we're spending no money, we're willing to live with all of the risk in the world. And so it's actually the opposite of this. So our risk is actually really high, and as we start to do things, it sort of drops down, and it goes down. The more we spend, it ends up down at nothing, conceptually at nothing. It's a terribly drawn graph. It really should probably be just that other side. Anyway, it should probably be about here. If we then look at this and go, okay, what do we actually... Where's my colour? How do I change my colour? There. If we look at this terribly drawn graph, there's actually this point in the middle where they cross over. And I've drawn it not great. They cross over, right? That's a perfect place. We've perfectly traded off our cost to our risk. So a lot of companies are trying to find that crossover point, and they hire accounting firms to help them find that middle point. But not all companies are actually in that sort of state, right? If we're a startup, let's say 3 people in this room found a company tomorrow, and they're doing their master's degree at the same time as they're doing their company, and they've got $0. They're a startup company. Where do they fall on the graph? They fall over here. They're somewhere over here. They've got a little bit of money they're spending, possibly, or they're spending a little bit of their time, and that is the resource that's there. Their cost there is their time. They've got a lot of risk they're living with. They're a startup, they've got no resources, and a net effect of that is they're very high in their amount of risk. A lot of startup companies fail. It's a very risky environment to be in. They've got a very high risk appetite. Figuring out the risk appetite of the company, it's a high risk appetite. What's the opposite of them? Opposite of them, that's got a very, very, very low risk appetite, could be something like a nation state, a country that spends billions or trillions of dollars on the security of the country. Pick one of the big ones, doesn't matter. They spend billions of dollars protecting themselves. Where do they fall on this graph? They're actually now falling on the cost line, maybe they're up here somewhere. So the policies they're enacting along this axis means that this is their actual cost they're spending. This is the amount of risk they actually have, which should have tapered off more for that much cost, but anyway. They're at different points. So as we drew these graphs and get an understanding of risk appetite, I should get better at drawing pictures, we find that some companies want to be in the middle. A mature, ongoing company that employs, 50 people or whatever, might be directly in the middle. A big multinational that's got lots and lots of money, a Google, a Facebook, an Apple, they all end up being fairly risk averse. They try to protect their share price at all costs. And so they end up tending to go up this way a little bit because they don't want their share price to go down. Once you've got a share price, you become more risk averse. Before you've got a share price, you're more likely to be risky. So hopefully that illustrates to us risk appetite. The risk appetite of our company then impacts what policies we're going to do, how much money we're going to spend. If a really big multinational company with billions of dollars and a stock price and stuff behaved in a super risky way, as an investor you would not be happy. You'd take your money straight out. You don't want them to stuff it up and lose all of your money. So there's that risk appetite. It's about an awareness of our company. Now, as we look at risk, we can actually start to categorise it a bit more as well and think of strategic risk, which is what's going to be cared about by those C-level execs, and it's what kind of situation are we in, what kinds of things could actually affect us in an ongoing and large way. And those sorts of risks are they're really evident from a risk appetite perspective, because it's the managers and the boss making a decision. And if they're very risk appetite because their eye is 100% on the stock price, you'll then see them to be very risk averse in that space. They might want to spend money to avoid particular strategic risks. Operational risks are different though. Operational risks are what people who aren't those senior level execs actually deal with. What is happening with a backup at a given moment of the day once it's been recorded? Have you walked to the coffee shop to get a coffee while holding the backup? That's something that the C-level exec would never know, but it is you walking and doing that. Funny little example there. A couple of years ago, I had a mate who drove a taxi. We've probably all known people who've driven taxis. But every Thursday night, he actually had his taxi booked out for the entire evening, from midnight to 6 a.m. It was a government department who did their backups and they finished at midnight, but they couldn't move it to the secure storage until 9 o'clock the next morning. So what they did, because they couldn't leave the backups on site, they called up the same taxi driver every single week, gave him the backups, he put him in the boot of his car, and he drove around Hobart, still getting other jobs and stuff. He was earning double money that night. And he had the backups in the back. Because if they were on site and the building burnt down, all in trouble. Their risk analysis was, well, we know where they are. They're actually not in the same building where we still are because we're doing other systems updates overnight. Bob, the taxi driver's got them. He's driving around with them. If he gets in a car crash, he's going to call us immediately. And that was sort of their very weird risk sort of choice. There's some logic there. You can kind of understand why they're thinking that works, and it does work. If that taxi driver was trying to rip them off, though, it'd be very easy for them to. But it was a very interesting operational risk. They couldn't have them in the same building, and their way of solving the problem was a taxi driver's boot of his car. Very funny. It amuses me, and it went on he did it for 5 or 6 years, every Thursday night. He'd pick up the backups, drive around Hobart doing his other jobs, return them at 9 o'clock, all done. Very odd choice. But our ICT risk impacts on both of our operational and strategic risk. What we're actually doing is a reflection of our security. The assurance we have on how secure we are is really tied to how well we are handling the risks we're actually facing. Now, this is not an exact science. We can't go, this is our risk, we're doing this, and we're perfectly handled, we're perfectly sorted. We can't actually know that for certain. It's definitely in the educated guess kind of category. With the Twin Towers in New York, one of them, at any given point in time, was insured for it to basically fall over, right? They had a terrorist attack against it in 96 where someone tried to bomb it with a little van full of explosives in the car park that didn't end up going off. And so they knew there was risk. But when the accountants did their risk analysis of the Twin Towers, they decided no one's going to blow up both of them in the same day. That can't happen. It just would not happen. So they ensured that one of them could be blown up or completely destroyed and the other one wouldn't be insured. They didn't define which one it was. It was just, we're insuring for the replacement cost of one of them, right? That didn't work out, which is a very morbid thought. But that's an example of handling risk. Their risk appetite was, we will insure one of the Twin Towers against total destruction on a given day. And that was a reasonable risk assessment. No one's actually particularly faulting that logic. What actually occurred was completely unpredictable. No one would have predicted that. That's what risk is like. You can't perfectly handle risk. You do your best effort. You do what fits inside of the actual costs you can spend, the amount of money you've got, your budget you've got, and you deal with that. It is estimates and guesses and imprecise dollar amounts. That's 3 different bullet points, all saying things that are not exact, that are not perfectly predictable. So a risk analysis is built on those. That's why you end up getting accountants involved and a whole bunch of people. It's not a one-person decision. You want lots of people looking at that risk and saying what they think it's going to be. Is it realistic? Is it realistic? So now as we're looking at this, we're looking to align this to our ICT, to our computer security stuff, and this is very much a key underpinning activity that occurs in ICT. This is actually where we justify our own jobs. If we did a risk analysis and said, oh, we're perfectly secure, we don't need any more security, it'd be a great day to get fired, really. Because if there's no risks, you don't need ICT people protecting you. So this is actually where we find what's there, and by being clear and honest about it and being good at our jobs and actually going, these are the threats that are there, we can't actually defend ourselves, we actually justify spending in our department to employers. This is actually how we end up justifying stuff. Now, that sounds very much like, hey, we're just getting job security, but that is part of it, because we know, as ICT professionals, we are never going to be secure. We can never be 100% secure. So doing our risk analysis helps us know where are we not secure? What do we need to do so that we're as secure as we can be? By doing all of that, we can then show the C-level execs that we're spending money on the right things and that we deserve our jobs, which is nice. But if stuff goes wrong, if we get attacked, and we get attacked on the things we thought we were going to be attacked on, our measures we have in place should defend us. That attack should be mitigated. There should be defensive measures in place that then show it was not successful, that they tried to get in and they couldn't. Then our reports that follow up afterwards that aren't being looked at in today's lecture are to the C-level execs. We go, these are all the attacks that happened last year that were not successful. We're then able to do that side of it. So we've got our risk analysis to say, these are what can go wrong. At the end of the year, we can say, these are the attacks that occurred. They align with our predictions. We actually successfully prevented them. Here's a list of new threats that I'm worried about for next year or moving forward, whatever the time frame might be. Justifying expense, justifying that, in fact, we live in a world where we've got to have money amounts inside of a budget and dealing with that. So as we go about doing these sorts of analysis, there's a whole bunch of ways of doing this. Again, the accounting department of the uni would be teaching risk analysis to the accountants. They do it in all aspects of a company, not just the computer systems. And we've got qualitative methods and quantitative methods. The quantitative ones, we're looking at trying to give a dollar value, trying to say how much money is it. Qualitative, we're trying to do low, medium, high impact to sort of get an idea of spreading them around. Now, we've got a couple of starting points. One, we could do it based on our outcomes of our threat analysis, the threat-based approach, which is what we've already looked at. The other one we could actually do, which is very much more the accounting way of it and not using the ICT knowledge, is go, what systems do we have in place? How much are they worth? What's our dependency analysis if one of these things goes down? How much money do we lose per hour of outage? And do it very much from a money-driven side of it. Both of those methods work, obviously, but we're obviously focused more on the threat-based because that's using our knowledge. So we can do the brainstorming we've already talked about. The other option we're not going to delve too much into is we can hire external people to come and just attack us. And they tell us where they got in, what's the easiest ways of getting in. Tiger teams are basically another term for a penetration tester. And they come and they spend a week trying to break in, trying to get into the systems in whatever way they can do. Government departments, utilities, water, power, they tend to, on a fairly regular basis, actually get people in to do this kind of thing. I happen to know that Tas Networks, for example, they have people visit every year and try and break into their systems, from over-the-wire hacking, through trying to get into power plants, through to dropping USB sticks in the car park of where most of them work on Creek Road in Moona, where Tas Networks is based. They do all of that sort of stuff. What is the easiest way to get into the system? Can we get through to the critical infrastructure connection points and that sort of stuff? This sort of Tiger team, to me, while extremely useful, is not the best approach, in my opinion, for starting this kind of process. It's much better as once you've got policy, once you've done your risk analysis and you've got everything happy and you're like, yep, we're secure, you get these guys in then. Are we actually realistic? Have we actually defended ourselves? Are we as secure as we think we are? As an assurance tool, am I secure? I think I am. I've done all this effort. Am I? Not necessarily as a first starting point. So, coming through some of these kind of quickly, we should look at 2 or 3 of these and the kinds of questions they build them around. When we get into our practical activity around the risk analysis, you might want to flick back through some of these slides. So one of them, which is by Bruce Schneier, who one of our readings is off, who's a very well-respected security author and from cryptography-based stuff originally. This is based on assets and working back from them. What assets are we trying to protect? What are the risks? How well does the security solution we have mitigate those risks? What other risks does this security solution cause? By us putting a measure in place, does that add to our risk profile? Have we now got another mode of attack that's opened because that thing is there? It's a very important question. What costs and trade-offs does the security solution impose? What is the effect to us? What is the cost to it? And try to see the impact of our measure. Another one from Flager and Flager, which this one's from a textbook I used to use in another course. So the library has multiple copies of this book. Security in computing is what it's called. First, identify the assets, determine the vulnerabilities, do the likelihood. So we've got threat analysis banging there at 0.3. Compute expected annual loss. Bring in the accountants. What's the loss if that server doesn't work? What's the loss if some other service isn't being delivered? Look at the applicable countermeasures and then look at what money we can save by deploying those countermeasures. So this one's very, very cost-driven after we first establish the threats. Now, another approach is to use attack trees. Who here came from a lecture with Luke this morning? Put your hand up. A bunch of you. In Luke's PhD, he did attack trees. He did attack trees in RFID networks. How can people attack RFID? And all of his stuff was based on doing attack trees in that space. So he actually knows way more about these than I do. He's written papers on them. So with these, what we're looking at doing is looking at all the steps and filling out an attack tree for the steps it takes to achieve a goal. And then from that, figure out what skill does it take to go along that branch to reach that goal. What cost does it take to go along that branch to reach that goal? If you list off all the different approaches to achieve a particular attack goal, what one's the cheapest? What one are people most likely to actually do? This way you actually get to see all the different ways someone might attack a thing and go, oh, there's 6 ways. 4 of them are expensive, are time-consuming, but they work. 2 of them are practically free and take no time. You defend against those 2. The other 4 that take lots of time and lots of money, you may not even bother defending against. The other 2 that are the free versions, you might put lots of effort to defend against those. So this is about visualising in trees the different methods that are possible to reach a goal. And so in Luke's thesis, he was doing attack trees to achieve certain attacks against RFID systems. And looking at what kind of cost is there, what's the impact of then doing that. So here's a completely trivial and toy example to illustrate that. Obtaining a password as a goal. There could be way more than just the 2 branches here, but we could have one where we get a diary, we look through it, and we then basically social engineer their diary to find out possible passwords. The other one, we just pay the person. Give them money to see what it is. Now, this one, the person might have no idea it's occurring. This one, they know what's occurring. So this one needs user education for them not to then give it up, or maybe you actually paid them enough in the first place. This one here is user education as well. Don't write your passwords in your diary. It's fairly straightforward. But it represents what we're kind of attempting to do with attack trees. Now, in Australia, and much like lots of countries, there's actually sort of government-suggested ways of doing this. There's a standard there, 4360, which is the code in Australia and New Zealand for undertaking a risk analysis. Now, this looks at the consequences to sort of motivate it then into our likelihood, and then we combine both of those into a priority matrix where we can then see what is high cost, what is high likelihood. If it's high cost and high likelihood, that's what we've got to defend against. If it's low cost and low likelihood, we might do nothing about it. Now, this standard includes a formal assessment. Again, lots of countries have these. In my experience with these, they're often not great. And if you end up wanting to work in this industry and you work at, say, one of the big 4 accounting firms or the second-tier accounting firms that go and do this as a job, their assessment tools match up with these formal assessments we see here, but they actually go way beyond it. The actual industry that does this, their assessment tools are actually really quite good, and they go well beyond what is recommended by most government bodies. NIST in America has their own ones as well. There'd be a European one. I'm not sure about Asian countries that might have them, subcontinent or otherwise. But what we have here is a formal assessment tool. We basically go in and we check boxes and we ask questions, and we're then able to compute a score. And so I've done a little bit of work with one of the big 4 accounting firms, and their paperwork for doing this is actually really useful. It's very number-driven. You tick things and it ends up spitting out a number, and you go and do this at lots of different segments of the company, and it then actually all gets collated and actually gives you quite useful analytics of the company's risk profile, of where they're vulnerable, things around staff training, staff education, security culture, all of that gets included as well. It's not just are the servers secured, it's very holistic. But these formal assessments then also look at the assets and all that sort of stuff. So there's examples in that legislation, or that standard rather, it's not legislation, and in Flager. If we look at the sort of steps outlined in that formal one and in Flager, there's 5 or 6 steps here. So steps 1, 2 and 3 are really stuff we've talked about largely today already, looking at what kind of vulnerabilities are present there, what's their likelihood, what's their history, getting all of those together. Part 4 is then assigning a cost to these, whether it's cost of the outage, cost of recovery, which is a dramatic part of these sorts of costs? Is it a legislative penalty for having that thing occur because you didn't do what you were supposed to do? What's the reputation cost? That's really hard to calculate. All those things. 5, new measures that we actually respond to deal with the likelihood to try and remove our risk, to mitigate our risk. And then 6, we work out, hey, we spent all this money. How much money did we save by spending this money? Because those things haven't occurred. If we look across all of those, what we see is that steps 1, 2 and 3 require, 1, 2, 3 and 5 require us. They require ICT professionals. They require the people that operate the systems, or at least people who can consult about those systems. We need the accountants for steps 4 and 6 to cost what's the outage cost if a thing occurred, and what's the saving? What is the real value of these security nerds who have come and said we need to do these things? So it is actually a teamwork thing, and all of this should then be tying back to the goals of the organisation. What are the things we're trying to protect? What kind of reputation are we trying to cultivate? What do we want the perception of us to be as a company? It's not uncommon to work with auditors who specialise in risk management. That's who I interacted with, one of the big fours, that come in and then do checkups every year. Are you following your own policies? Are your risk assessments lining up with what you think they truly are? Our next lecture is going to be talking about step 5. So step 5 is, what are our new measures? Or what measures do we have that we're currently doing that we're now formalising in a document to actually protect our company? How are we actually protecting ourselves against these things occurring? Now, as I said, some of these, if it's the first time a company has produced a policy document, it may well be that they're just writing down all the things they currently do because they're very secure. What that document gives them then is a document they can train new employees with, so that they keep doing the good practice we're already doing. If you think about startups that are successful, they often have a couple of very smart people who come up with a very good idea and carry that out well. So they, at that start, may be doing the correct thing. They may be actually secure. They may not be, but they may actually be secure, because those guys are all actually the smart guys with the original idea. As the company grows, they pick up new hires who don't own the company, who aren't smart enough to have the good idea in the first place. And so you want to be able to train them into the correct behaviour. And so policy document, which is what we're looking at in the next lecture, that builds off of our risk analysis, is about making sure you've got a way of training staff into secure behaviour. So what's our key outcomes? We want to know what our risks are. Now, these are built upon our threats. What's the impact of these risks if they eventuated? If someone stole our database, what is the impact? I'm sure at Facebook at the moment, and the last couple of weeks or even months, they've been doing this risk equation in their head about how the hell they deal with their current Cambridge Analytica stuff. How do we deal with this? How do we protect the reputation? How do we protect the stock price, right? How does this compare to our threat likelihood? So what's the impact? What's the likelihood? Things that are a high likelihood and a high impact, those are our priorities. We need to get both of those outputs side by side to figure out what we're actually going to defend. So what's some disadvantages of a risk analysis? Well, they cost time, they cost money. There is a cost there. It's not a free thing that you do. It's a costly thing. And it's a costly thing that's built on estimates, guesstimates, imprecise measurements. It is not a perfect science. You're not actually going to get out of it a value you know is 100% correct. You actually know that there's a fuzziness to it, that it is a prediction. It is not actually what could happen. It could be well worse. Sony's an example of that. Sony actually did a risk assessment around what would the cost be of a complete breach. And the number that they spat out from that was like a couple of $1 million. It cost them like $1.4 billion. They were off by like a factor of 10. Risk analysis is imprecise. The better we are at it, the better in the long run, but it's not actually something you know is perfect. Now, these can actually give us a false sense of security, and historically speaking, that was very true. But as we saw from that survey at the start, our C-level execs at this point are almost the ones that are most informed about how poor security is and almost how we're not always that secure. It's not true of everywhere, but that false sense of security is what we think if we think, oh, I've done this, now we're perfectly secure. That is not the case. C-level execs these days, CEOs, CTOs, CISOs, all of those are all now knowing we're doing these, but stuff could still go wrong. Stuff goes wrong to big companies all the time. Yahoo got hacked 2 years ago, whatever it was. Billions of dollar company from Silicon Valley, should be doing security properly, weren't. So there's always problems of over and underestimate. If we underestimate, it's an obvious problem. If we overestimate, we spend more money than we need to, we might then affect our company negatively. So there's the over as well. Benefits. It makes people think about the value of the assets in the company. From a staff training perspective, if done well, it makes your staff feel like they're a valuable asset to the company. That's an important factor. They can see their role there. It helps people understand the impact of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, through their entire setup of the company and the infrastructure. And it enables us to actually have guidelines around our security measures that justifies our spending, helps us to keep employed. So here's the summary. I just sort of summarised a lot of it just then. Our next lecture, though, we're going to respond to this. Threats and risks presents us with a picture of our company. We need to respond to that. Our major assignment is us having a case study of a company that we do a risk and threat analysis for. And that's going to be a couple of pages of the assignment. The bulk of the assignment is actually going to be on policy about responding to our risk and threat analysis, where we write down what policies should this company actually have to protect themselves from the risks and threats that they're facing. And so we're going to have a risk and threat analysis practical, where we in our groups do a risk and threat analysis, and then we're going to have 2 more practicals that follow that, where we break down all those risks and threats into different categories and come up with policies in those different categories as a group that eventually end up writing up into a document. That's what we submit in week 13. So the next lecture is going to build on this, right where we left off, looking at policy. And at the end of that lecture around policy, I'll then have probably a 5 or 6 slide lecture segment about the assignment, right? So it's very important you're at that next lecture to understand what is the assignment. How am I going to get marked? What do I have to submit? How is it going to actually operate? So that's what's coming next. Does anyone have any questions? Brilliant. Just a reminder, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday this week are normal classes. Thursday, Friday become Thursday, Friday next week, because they've got a couple of public holidays coming up this week. And no lecture in week 6, because I'll be on a plane. I'll be landed by now. I'll be on a plane flying to Hobart at 11:30.